She was a doctor who helped strangers build families while quietly bearing her own chance of ever having one. And the morning she decided to stop waiting for love and just handle it herself, she had no idea she was walking into the most dangerous decision of her life. A paperwork error, a man with a false name, and a child now carrying blood that half of Chicago's underworld would kill to control. Like this video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because the moment Eliana Mercer chose the cheapest donor on the list, fate chose her right back. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation, the way it always did before 7 in the morning. Eliana Mercer walked through the side entrance at 6:42, badge already clipped to her coat, coffee already cold in her hand. She didn't stop at the reception desk, didn't say good morning to the overnight tech who was clearly running on his third energy drink. She moved the way she always moved through this building. Fast, purposeful, without the kind of eye contact that invited conversation she didn't have time for. The Northwestern Reproductive Institute occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a glass tower on East Illinois Street, and on any given morning, Eliana could walk its corridors with her eyes half closed and still not bump into anything. She knew every cabinet, every corner, every supply closet that squeaked when you pushed it wrong. She'd spent 11 years here. She knew this place better than she knew her own apartment, and she was more comfortable in it too, which was maybe the saddest thing about her life that she refused to examine too closely. She was 38 years old, board-certified in reproductive endocrinology and infertility, published in 4 peer-reviewed journals, lead physician on over 600 successful IVF cycles. She had helped women in their mid-20s and women in their mid-40s. She had helped single mothers and married couples and a 51-year-old appellate judge who had cried in Eliana's office for 40 minutes before composing herself and writing a check. She had held hands through miscarriages and phone calls through positive betas, and she had learned over the course of her career to separate what she felt from what she was doing because the work required it. What she had not done, in 11 years of helping other people become parents, was seriously pursue becoming one herself. That was the part she was fixing now. She dropped into her desk chair and pulled up her patient portal, but she wasn't checking her patient files. She opened a secondary window, the one she'd bookmarked 4 months ago, and visited approximately 40 times since then without ever doing anything about it. The Institute's internal donor catalog. Not the premium tier, not the expanded profiles with the childhood photos, and the handwritten letters and the genetic testing panels that ran to 14 pages and cost $3,000 just for the selection consultation. The standard catalog. Anonymous. Efficient. $42 processing fee on top of whatever her insurance covered, which was, as of last year's policy review, almost everything. Her colleagues would be horrified if they knew. Several of them had built small side empires advising patients on donor selection, treating it like a luxury concierge service, steering wealthy clients toward men with Ivy League degrees and competitive athletic records, and, in one memorable case, a semi-professional viola career. Eliana had sat in enough of those consultations to know that the premium catalog was mostly theater. The genetic outcomes were statistically comparable. The extra money bought narrative, not biology. She didn't need a narrative. She needed a sperm sample, a clear schedule, and 4 to 6 weeks of progesterone supplementation. She was a physician. She knew exactly what she was doing. She scrolled to donor 1117. No photo. No personal statement. Age 34. Height 6'1". Blood type O negative. Health screening, clean panel, no flagged hereditary conditions. Education listed as vocational training completed. The profile was sparse to the point of feeling almost deliberately minimal, which was actually what had caught her attention the first time she'd looked at it. No embellishment, no curated presentation, just numbers and clean test results, and a processing code that meant he'd been through the clinic's standard third-party anonymization protocol. She'd been circling back to 1117 for weeks, not because of any romantic notion about the sparse profile, because the numbers were good and the price was right, and she was tired of making this into something it didn't need to be. She moved her cursor to the selection button and clicked it before she could talk herself out of it again. The confirmation window appeared. She read it twice, authorized the charge to her clinic staff account, and closed the secondary window. Then she picked up her cold coffee and stared at the wall for a moment. That was it. She had a consult at 8, a monitoring ultrasound at 9:15, 2 embryo transfers back-to-back between 10 and noon, and a department meeting at 2 that she was already dreading. She did not have time to sit here examining what she'd just done. She opened her actual patient files and got to work. The day moved the way busy days moved, fast until it wasn't, and then suddenly very strange. The strange part came at 3:40 in the afternoon, when her nurse practitioner, Danny Foss, knocked on the office door with a look on her face that Eliana had learned to associate with administrative disasters. Danny was 31, meticulous, and almost impossible to rattle. The fact that she looked rattled was notable. "We have a verification problem," Danny said. Eliana put down her pen. "What kind?" "Donor catalog. The anonymization processing for a new intake got cross-filed with an existing active profile during the system migration last week. 8 flagged it this morning, but the timing is bad because the donor is physically here right now for his standard quarterly health screen, and there's a consent gap in the updated records that legally needs to be resolved before we can process any pending selections on the profile." Eliana stared at her. "Which profile?" Danny hesitated just long enough that Eliana already knew the answer before she said it. 1117. The pause that followed was brief. Eliana was good at brief pauses. She'd had 11 years of practice keeping her face composed when things went sideways in clinical settings. And the discipline extended to moments like this, where the information was personal but the context was professional, and she needed to handle it the way she handled everything else in this building, cleanly, without letting her own situation color her judgment. "Is he consenting to the correction or contesting it?" she asked. "He hasn't been fully briefed yet. The front desk was going to handle it, but they're swamped from the afternoon rush, and Dr. Petrov is the attending on intake today, but he's in surgery until 5, and I'll handle it," Eliana said. She was already standing. "Where is he?" "Room 3 consultation, the second floor annex." She grabbed his intake folder from Danny's hands and walked. The annex consultation rooms were quieter than the main floor, smaller, with frosted glass panels and the kind of neutral gray furniture that was meant to be inoffensive and succeeded mostly in being forgettable. Eliana pushed through the door to room 3 without knocking, which was a habit she was sometimes criticized for and had never successfully broken. And then she stopped. The man sitting in the chair beside the small table wasn't what she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected exactly. She hadn't thought about it long enough to form an expectation. Some version of the statistical middle of the men who came through the clinic's donor program, she supposed. A mix of college students, young professionals, men in their 20s and early 30s doing it for the financial supplement. This man was none of those things. Or rather, he was all of the demographic categories on paper, but the categories didn't quite account for what she saw when she walked in. He was sitting with the particular kind of stillness that wasn't tension and wasn't relaxation, but something in between. The stillness of a person who was very accustomed to waiting and had made a private peace with it. He was tall even sitting, long legs stretched slightly forward, hands resting on his thighs. Dark hair, slightly longer than a professional cut, pushed back without deliberateness. A faint scar near the left side of his jaw, barely visible. He wore work clothes, dark canvas pants, a plain gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows. And they were clean but carried the honest wear of actual use, not the studied casualness of someone trying to look like they worked with their hands. His eyes came up when she entered, gray-green, calm. "Dr. Mercer," she said, and heard herself give her own name like an announcement rather than an introduction, which was not how she usually began conversations. She adjusted. "There's an administrative issue with your profile that needs your signature on an updated consent form. I'll explain what happened, and it should take less than 10 minutes. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. Not assessment, exactly. More like a brief, unhurried recalibration. "All right," he said. His voice was even, slightly low, with a very faint accent she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, maybe, worn down almost to nothing by time or effort. She pulled the second chair away from the wall and sat across from him, which was not what she usually did with paperwork issues. Usually she stood, kept it moving, in and out. But the room was small, and standing over him felt wrong for reasons she wasn't going to examine right now. She opened the folder and explained the migration error, the consent gap, what the updated forms required. She kept it clinical. He listened without interrupting, which was not something people always did, and when she finished, he said, "You need me to initial the amendment and sign the reauthorization." "That's correct." "And this resolves the issue fully." "Legally, yes." He nodded once. She slid the forms across. He took the pen from the folder's interior pocket. She'd clipped it there out of habit, because she always had a pen, and he read both forms before signing. Not skimmed. Read. Line by line, which again was not what she expected. Most people in administrative situations signed wherever the doctor pointed without reading. The fact that he didn't was either careful or suspicious, and she filed it away under careful and moved on. Adrian Voss, she read from the top of the form, because the name was there and she'd already read it. He signed, slid the forms back. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "No, thank you for your patience with the delay." He stood, and she became immediately aware that 6'1" on paper meant genuinely tall in a small consultation room, and that the stillness she'd noticed sitting was even more pronounced standing because he moved to pick up his jacket from the back of the chair with the kind of controlled economy that most people spent years in physical training trying to achieve without making it look like they'd spent years trying. She stood too, because staying seated while he was on his feet felt like a mistake for reasons she couldn't articulate. "The file mix-up," he said, pausing with the jacket in his hand. "The system migration. Was patient data exposed?" She looked at him. "The anonymization protocol is intact. No identifying information on either end was visible to any third party." Something moved behind his eyes. Not relief exactly. Something more like a calculation being run and completed. "Good," he said, and that was all. He put on the jacket. He left. Eliana stood in the empty consultation room for a moment after the door closed. She was aware that she was still holding the folder. She was also aware that her pulse had done something slightly uncharacteristic in the last 4 minutes, which she attributed to the disruption in her afternoon schedule and not to anything else, because she was a rational person and that was the rational attribution. She walked back to her office. She did not think about Adrian Voss again for the rest of that day. 3 weeks later, at 7:17 on a Tuesday morning, Eliana performed her own intrauterine insemination in the clinic's procedure room C, with Danny Foss present as clinical witness and the clean donor sample from Profile 1117 processed, washed, and transferred without complication. The procedure took 11 minutes. Eliana had performed it on patients over 200 times. Performing it on herself was clinically identical and felt completely different, which she had anticipated and had decided in advance not to spend time on. The emotional content of this moment, whatever it was, could be processed later, in private, at a time she had scheduled for the purpose. Right now, it was a procedure. She was a physician. This was her area of expertise. She had this completely under control. She lay on the narrow exam table for the standard 10-minute post-procedure rest period, stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles, and thought about nothing. She was very good at thinking about nothing. The next 14 days were the longest she could remember in several years. She didn't tell anyone at the clinic. She considered telling her friend Nora Vance, who was an OB across town, and who would understand without requiring a long explanation, and then decided against it because Nora would worry in a way that was loving but exhausting, and because telling someone made it real in a way that could also make failing real, and Eliana was not ready for that particular vulnerability. She ate well. She reduced her call hours to avoid the overnight stress load. She took her progesterone. She ran 2 miles in the morning when she had time. She did not check her beta until the agreed 14-day mark, which required a level of self-discipline that she was in some ways more proud of than anything else she'd managed in this process. The beta came back positive. She sat in her car in the clinic parking garage for 20 minutes before she went upstairs to her first appointment. She cried twice in those 20 minutes. Not from happiness exactly, or not only from that. From the particular release of a tension she hadn't known she'd been carrying so long, it had started to feel like posture. The kind of tension that comes from wanting something for so long that you've trained yourself to believe you don't want it anymore because belief is cheaper than hope. She wiped her face. She went to work. She was going to be fine. She was a reproductive endocrinologist with excellent health, a solid financial position, and the professional knowledge to navigate every stage of this pregnancy. She had this planned. She did not need anything she didn't already have. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks and 3 days after her positive beta, when she was walking from the clinic's parking structure to the building's side entrance. The SUV was black and it was parked against the curb across the street, which was not unusual. There were always cars parked on that block. What was unusual was that it was the same SUV she'd seen in the same position the previous Wednesday and the Wednesday before that. And she realized this only because she'd been late both of those evenings and had come out through the side entrance specifically because she was rushing. And the vehicle had registered on the edge of her awareness both times without resolving into anything she'd classified as a pattern. It registered now. She slowed her pace, watching it from her peripheral vision. No plates visible from this angle. The windows were tinted to the legal limit. The engine wasn't running, she didn't hear it, but there was a very faint exhaust plume rising from the rear that said otherwise. She walked past it without looking directly at it, got to her car, drove home by a different route than usual, which she told herself was a practical experiment and not fear because she didn't have enough information yet to justify fear. She was careful. She was systematic. These were the two qualities that had gotten her through medical school and through a residency that had broken 3 of her peers and through 11 years of high-stakes clinical medicine. She applied them now. Over the next 6 days, she documented 3 more sightings of the same vehicle, or one with the same physical profile, at 3 different locations within 2 blocks of her regular daily movements. She also noticed, on the Thursday morning, that a car she'd seen twice in her parking structure was not registered to any of her building's tenants. She checked the building's visitor log with her building manager, citing a minor security concern, which was not inaccurate. She also noticed that someone had accessed the clinic's patient filing system twice in the past 10 days. She saw this because she happened to be reviewing system access logs related to an unconnected billing audit, and a set of access attempts on a specific records partition appeared in the log with credentials she didn't recognize. She flagged it to IT. IT said they'd look into it. She did not yet connect these things to each other. They were separate, minor, individually explicable incidents. She was a pregnant woman working long hours under hormonal and physical changes. She was perhaps slightly more attuned to threat perception than usual. She was not paranoid. She was organized. On a Tuesday at approximately 8:15 in the evening, she was leaving the clinic via the underground parking level. She'd taken to varying her exit routes after the SUV sightings. And she was 3 cars from her own when she heard footsteps behind her that did not slow when she slowed. She turned. There were 2 of them, both male, both large, moving with the practiced non-urgency of men who knew they had the numerical and physical advantage and were comfortable taking their time about it. One of them had his hands in the pockets of a jacket that was too heavy for the October night, and the weight distribution said clearly that what was in the right pocket was not his phone. Eliana's mind processed this with clinical speed. Threat. Close proximity. Exit routes. Behind her was the elevator she'd just come from, which required a key card, at least 10 seconds. To her left was the stairwell to the lobby. Unlocked, 40 feet away. To her right was the vehicular ramp, open to street level, 80 feet. She ran for the stairwell. She was fast. She maintained the running habit because it was medically sound, and also because she had a vague background awareness that Chicago at night was not a city where a woman alone benefited from being slow. She hit the stairwell door at a hard push and took the stairs 2 at a time and came out into the lobby going fast enough that the evening receptionist, Marcus, actually stood up from his chair. "Dr. Mercer, call security to parking level B, right now, 2 individuals. Do it now, Marcus." Marcus picked up the phone. Eliana stood in the lobby with her back against the wall beside the stairwell door, watching it. Her breathing was even, deliberately, forcibly even. Her hands were shaking, which she did not have time to address. The door did not open. Security came down in 4 minutes. They found nothing. The 2 men were gone. The camera footage from that section of the garage showed a 14-second gap, a loop. Someone had cut the feed. The security officer wrote a report. He recommended she file a police report as a precaution, which she did the following morning, though the officer who took her statement had the bored expression of a man who filed a lot of reports about things that didn't result in anything. That night, in her apartment on the 22nd floor, Eliana sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and the 3 separate pieces of information she had accumulated, and she put them together. She was being watched. The clinic's records had been accessed. Someone had tried to stop her from leaving that parking garage tonight. The logic connected with a precision she found almost insulting in its clarity. She was a pregnant woman with no violent enemies, no criminal associations, no reason she could conceive of for anyone to have any interest in her whatsoever except through the clinic. The clinic was the only institution where anything about her life had changed in the past 2 months. And what had changed at the clinic was that she was now connected to a patient file, a donor file, that someone had tried twice to access through unauthorized channels. Profile 1117. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the man in the consultation room, his stillness, the way he'd read every line of the consent forms rather than skimming them, the way he'd asked whether patient data had been exposed, and the specific quality of the calculation that had moved behind his eyes when she'd said the anonymization protocol was intact. She thought about a man who worked in vocational trades, who registered for a low-cost anonymous donor program, who came in for quarterly health screens with the kind of controlled, economical, physical presence that she associated not with mechanics, but with people who had spent significant time in environments where physical control was survival. She thought about the name on the form, Adrian Voss. She opened her laptop and typed it into a general search. Nothing unusual came back. A LinkedIn profile with sparse information, a minor business registration in Indiana for a sole proprietor auto repair shop, a few scattered public records. Everything clean, everything slightly too clean, with the specific quality of administrative cleanliness that came from effort rather than from an ordinary person who simply didn't have a large digital footprint. She stared at the screen. She was carrying this man's child. She was 5 weeks and 6 days pregnant, and she did not know who he was. Her phone rang. The number was blocked. She stared at it for 3 rings and then answered because she was not someone who didn't answer. Dr. Mercer. The voice was low and even and carried the faint residue of an accent she had heard once before, in a small consultation room on the 2nd floor of a building that was currently 22 floors below her. I'm sorry for calling at this hour. I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds. Eliana said nothing. There are people watching your building. They are not from any law enforcement agency. They have been looking for a specific patient file in your clinic's system, and they have now determined that the simplest path to that file is through you directly. You are not safe in that apartment tonight. Her pulse was very steady. That particular reaction, the controlled pulse in crisis, was one of the things that made her good at her job, and she was grateful for it now. Who are you? She said. A pause. Brief. The kind that carries weight. Not who I said I was, he said. I'll explain everything, but right now I need you to take your go bag, if you have one, and leave through the building's service exit on the west side of the ground floor. There's a gray vehicle at the corner of Illinois and Wabash. The driver's name is Yuri. Tell him the word is clean. Can you do that? I'm not going anywhere with a stranger based on a phone call, Eliana said. I know. His voice didn't change. And I understand why. But in approximately 12 minutes, the men watching your building are going to stop watching and start moving, and the lobby security in your building consists of one desk guard who is 61 years old and has never been in a situation that involved the people who are coming. So I'm asking you to make a choice. She looked at her laptop screen. At the name Adrian Voss and its too clean trail of ordinary documentation. If I walk out that service exit and you are not what you say you are, then you'll have wasted 12 minutes, he said. But I am what I say I am. At this moment, I am the only person between you and people who want to use you as leverage. Your child is the reason. I will explain the rest when you're safe. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. I don't have a go bag, she said. Then take your keys, your phone, your medication, and your coat. You have time for nothing else. She was already standing. She grabbed the progesterone from the bathroom cabinet. Her phone was in her hand. Her keys were on the hook by the door. She pulled her coat off the rack without breaking stride. She went to the service exit. The gray vehicle was at the corner exactly where he'd said. The driver was a broad, quiet man in his 50s with hands that had been broken and reset at least once. She told him the word was clean. He pulled away from the curb without comment. Outside the city's office windows, Chicago moved past in its usual indifferent light and noise, and Eliana sat in the back seat of a car belonging to a man she didn't know, carrying a baby whose father she now understood, with a cold, settling certainty she did not know at all. She put her hand on her stomach, just for a second. Brief, practical. She needed answers. She needed them tonight, and she needed them from the man on the phone, whoever he actually was, because the name Adrian Voss had always been a shell, and whatever was underneath it had just reached through her carefully constructed independent life and changed every single thing about it. The city fell behind them. The gray vehicle moved toward the expressway, and the man who had told her his name was Adrian Voss was waiting somewhere in the dark ahead of her with the truth she hadn't known she needed, about who he was, about what she was carrying, and about what it was going to cost her to survive the night. The vehicle turned off the expressway at an exit Eliana didn't recognize, then moved through a series of streets that grew progressively quieter and darker until the city's ambient glow was something visible only behind them, a pale smear on the low clouds. She didn't ask where they were going. She sat with her coat pulled across her lap and watched the driver's hands on the wheel and cataloged what she knew, which was very little, and what she suspected, which was worse. Yuri drove without speaking. He hadn't spoken since she'd given him the word at the corner. He handled the car with the unconscious precision of a man who spent most of his waking life in one, checking mirrors at intervals that were too regular to be casual, never letting his speed drift above or below the limit by more than 2 miles per hour. Professional. Trained. Not a driver the way a person who drove for a living was a driver. A driver the way a weapon was a tool. Specific, maintained, deployed. She filed that away. They pulled through a gate set into a high stone perimeter wall, the kind of wall that announced its purpose without apology. The gate closed behind them before the vehicle had fully cleared it. The estate beyond was large, though she couldn't determine the full extent of it in the dark. She registered a gravel drive, mature trees, exterior lighting that was strategic rather than decorative, illuminating perimeter zones rather than aesthetics. The house itself was a converted industrial structure, original brick with modern additions, the kind of renovation that cost more than most people made in a lifetime and chose not to advertise the fact. Yuri stopped the car at the front entrance. He got out and opened her door without being asked. She got out. Her legs were steady. She was grateful for that. The front door opened before she reached it. Cassian Dragovich, she still thought of him as Voss, and would for longer than she would have liked, stood in the doorway in a different set of clothes than whatever he'd been wearing when he called her. Dark trousers and a shirt with the collar open and the sleeves rolled to the forearms. And he looked nothing like the man who had sat in the consultation room signing consent forms. The stillness was the same. The calibrated calm was the same. But in the consultation room, those qualities had read as patience. Here, in his own space, they read as something else. Command, maybe. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. He stepped back to let her in. She walked past him into a wide entrance hall with concrete floors and high ceilings, and the particular quality of silence that thick walls create. A man she didn't know stood near the far wall, younger, lean, with the watchful stillness of someone whose job was to watch. Another man was visible through a doorway, moving past without looking in. She counted what she could see and mentally noted what she couldn't. "You're going to tell me everything," she said. She did not phrase it as a request. "Yes," Cassian said. "Sit down first." "I'll stand." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected, and moved toward the room off the main hall, and she followed him. It was a study or a library, she couldn't decide which. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk that was covered with papers that had been spread with intent rather than carelessness, a low table near the window with a map laid out across it that he folded closed when they entered with a motion so practiced it was barely a motion at all. He stood near the desk. She stood near the door. They looked at each other across about 8 feet of floor space. "Your real name," she said. "Cassian Dragovich." She let that sit for a second. It meant nothing to her, which told her something about the boundaries of her own world. It clearly was supposed to mean something. The slight tension around his jaw when he said it, not shame, not exactly, more like the brace of a man who had said his own name in rooms where it produced fear and had grown accustomed to monitoring that reaction, told her it was a name that carried weight she didn't yet understand. "The donor program," she said. "Was that deliberate?" "No." His voice was flat. "I was at the clinic for a different purpose. There was a situation. I needed a legitimate medical record trail under a secondary identity. The donor program was one of several administrative channels my physician used to establish the alias. I didn't expect to be present at the clinic in person. An operational change required it. An operational change, she repeated. An attempt on my life. I needed to be in a building with controlled access and no connection to my actual identity for approximately 4 hours. The clinic was the safest available option that morning. She breathed in through her nose slowly. You used my clinic as a safe house. Yes. And the paperwork error was genuine. I didn't engineer it. A pause. I didn't know about the insemination until 6 weeks ago. How? My physician monitors the identity records for any administrative anomalies. A secondary flag came through when a sample withdrawal was processed. He informed me. He stopped. I ordered the records destroyed immediately. But the rival families had already moved faster than I anticipated. Someone inside the clinic's administrative processing, not medical staff, records management, had been working for the Vasiliev network for 8 months. They identified the withdrawal, traced the anonymization protocol, and connected the profile to my alias before my physician could complete the erasure. Eliana absorbed that. Her hands were at her sides. She was aware of them wanting to move, to cross over her stomach, to do the thing her body kept wanting to do since the pregnancy registered as real. And she kept them still because she was not going to perform vulnerability in front of this man while she was still assembling what he was telling her. The Vasiliev network, she said, one of 4 organized crime families currently in conflict with my operations across the northern United States and parts of Canada. The largest, the most aggressive. He said it with no particular effect, the way she described a difficult prognosis to a patient, not without awareness of the weight of the information, but without allowing that weight to distort the delivery. When they learned of the pregnancy, they made a strategic decision. You are more useful to them as leverage than as a secondary target. Leverage to do what? To compel me to withdraw from a territorial dispute that has been escalating for 14 months. There are significant financial interests at stake. Port operations, import infrastructure, several legitimate business layers that function as cover for distribution networks. If they hold you, I negotiate from weakness. If they hold the child, he stopped. Say it, she said. If they hold my child, I lose every strategic position I've spent 3 years building, and I hand them a dynasty. The word landed in the room. Dynasty. She heard it the way you heard a word that belonged to a different century, a different kind of world than the one she'd been living in an hour ago, and it reframed everything she was looking at. This house, this man, the controlled movements of the people in the hallway, with an awful, clarifying precision. How many people want to kill you? She said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the distant cousin of one. Currently, a fluctuating number. That's not an answer. 4 families, approximately 40 to 60 operatives with active deployment authorization, plus any freelance contractors they've brought in for this specific operation. He said it evenly. Against which I have 31 people on this property and a network of approximately 200 with varying response times and capability levels. 31. She looked around the room as if she could perceive them through the walls, all 31, and found instead that she was perceiving the weight of the building itself, its thick walls, its controlled lighting, its closed gate, and understanding that she was standing inside a fortress, and that she had not noticed because fortresses looked like ordinary things when they were doing their job. I am not going to be used as leverage, she said. I'm going to leave this building, go to the police, file a full report, and move somewhere that none of these people can find me. You could try that, Cassian said. But the Vasiliev network has 2 Cook County sheriff's deputies and a federal customs agent on their payroll. I don't know which specific officers. You don't either. Any police report you file goes into a system that at least 2 of those people can access. His voice didn't change. He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was listing facts. Additionally, you'd need to leave this property to reach the police, and between this property and any precinct in the city, there are currently 3 mobile surveillance units tracking this location at intervals. Yuri's routing on the way here delayed their acquisition of your destination by approximately 40 minutes. That window is narrowing. She was quiet for a moment. You planned for me to come here, she said. I planned for the possibility that you would need somewhere to go. Yes. Without asking me, I didn't have a way to ask you that didn't also alert the people watching you that I'd made contact. His jaw tightened very slightly. I understand that's not a satisfying distinction. No, she said. It's not. The silence stretched. She looked at the closed map on the table, and the papers on the desk, and the man standing in the middle of all of it with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did, holding whatever was underneath it at a precise and practiced distance from the surface. My clinic, she said. My patients. Your patients are not targets. The access attempts on the system stopped when they identified what they were looking for. They don't care about the clinic. They care about the pregnancy. My staff. Safe. As long as you're not there. She heard what that meant. As long as she was not there, bringing this to them. She heard it, and she didn't like it. And it was true. And she knew it was true. And that was almost worse than if it had been a manipulation, because a manipulation she could push back against. But a truth just sat there in the room and demanded to be dealt with. I want to speak to your physician, she said, the one who monitors your records. He paused. Why? Because I'm pregnant and I've been under significant physiological stress for approximately 3 hours, and I need to know whether the progesterone supplementation I have with me is adequate for the next 48 hours, or whether I need something from a pharmacy, and I'm not taking medical advice from you. She held his gaze. I want a doctor. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the desk and picked up his phone and typed a single short message without looking down at the keypad. He'll be here in 20 minutes, he said. Good. She walked to the chair nearest the bookshelf and sat in it. Not because she needed to sit. Because she chose to, and choosing things was, at this precise moment, the only form of control she had access to, and she was going to use every available version of it. Cassian stayed near the desk. He didn't speak. She didn't ask him to. The physician arrived in 18 minutes, which told her he'd been close, on call probably, in the specific way that a private physician to a man like Cassian Dragovich was on call, which was to say constantly and without the option of unavailability. His name was Dr. Marcus Fenn, 60s, lean, with the careful hands and the careful eyes of a man who had practiced medicine in contexts where errors had consequences beyond malpractice. He carried a proper medical bag. He was professional, thorough, and asked her exactly the right questions in exactly the right order, which told her his obstetrics knowledge was current despite the obvious focus of his primary practice. He confirmed the supplementation was adequate. He took her blood pressure, elevated, unsurprisingly, which he noted without alarm. He checked her pulse. He told her to rest when she could, to eat something before morning, to avoid any further acute stress if that was possible, which they both understood was a clinical recommendation encountering significant practical obstacles. How many pregnant women have you treated in a situation like this? She asked him before he closed his bag. Fenn looked at her steadily. None. Right, she said. He left. She sat alone in the study for about 4 minutes before Cassian came back in. He was carrying a plate, actual food, bread and some kind of protein, put together without ceremony, and he set it on the low table near her chair without being asked and without commenting on the gesture. She ate because Fenn had told her to, and because her body was telling her the same thing, and she had learned a long time ago to listen to her body even when the circumstances made it feel like the least important problem. She ate. He sat across the room in the chair at his desk and looked at the papers there without touching them. Tell me the rest, she said, when half the plate was gone. He looked up. Whatever I don't know yet. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment, then he began to talk. He told her about the Dragovich network, what it was, what it had been when his father built it, what it had become in the 8 years since Cassian had controlled it. He told her about the civil conflict that had been escalating since a territorial agreement collapsed 14 months ago, about the specific intersection of criminal and financial interest that made the Northern Corridor so valuable that 4 separate organizations were willing to go to war over it. He told her about the legitimate infrastructure, the hospitals that his money funded, the witness protection network that operated outside official channels, because the official channels had been compromised, the network of shelters and safe houses that had started as a practical asset and become something he hadn't expected. He told her with the specific flatness of a man who had long ago stopped interpreting these facts as either condemnation or defense, who was simply laying them down the way you laid down a map. Here is the terrain. Here are the features. Here is where you are standing. She listened without commenting until he was done. You built the shelter network, she said. My operations director built it. I funded it. Why? He looked at her. The question was a different question than it appeared, and they both understood that, and he knew she wasn't going to let him answer the surface version. Because the women who ended up in those situations were usually there because of men like me, he said. Not me specifically, but the industry, the world. A pause. It didn't feel adequate. It was what was available. She looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he moved slightly, a barely perceptible shift of weight, the first evidence of discomfort she'd seen from him. That doesn't change what you are, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She put the plate down. She was tired, the kind of tired that came from adrenaline burning off and leaving the body to account for everything it had spent in the last several hours, and underneath the tired was something she was not ready to name. Not softness toward him. She was firm about that. She was not going to let one honest answer in the middle of a crisis become a reinterpretation of everything. But something. She was going to have to make decisions. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully understood when she'd walked out of her apartment building. The plan she'd had, independent pregnancy, controlled environment, known variables, was not available to her in the form she'd designed it. The variables had changed. The environment had changed. And the most important constant, the decision she'd made to do this alone, on her own terms, with no complications that looked like need, that constant was under severe pressure from all directions. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A news alert. Her General Chicago notifications. She read it and the bottom dropped out of her stomach. Gas explosion, East Illinois Street. Residential building, 22 floors. Fire crews responding. She stared at the alert. Then she looked up at Cassian. He was already reading something on his own phone, his face absolutely still in the way it went still when information arrived that required processing before reaction. That's my building, she said. Yes. That's not a gas explosion. No, he said. It's not. She set her phone face down on her knee. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh and felt the tremor in it and refused to let it move anywhere else. They didn't know I was gone, she said. They knew within the last hour. This is a message. His voice was quiet, controlled in the way that controlled things are controlled when the discipline holding them is working hard. They are telling me they will burn down anything adjacent to you if I don't respond to their terms. What are their terms? My withdrawal from the Northern Corridor, signed transfer of the port infrastructure, complete exit from 3 distribution networks. He set his phone down with the same flat, final precision he used for everything. I have until Friday. Friday was 3 days away. And if you don't, he looked at her directly. They come here. The fire at her building was still burning on the news alert. 22 floors. Her apartment was on the 22nd. She thought about the plant on her kitchen windowsill that she'd kept alive for 3 years through what she'd always privately considered sheer stubbornness, and the framed print above her desk, and the careful, organized order of her medical books along the hallway shelf. She thought about all of it burning and felt something that was not grief exactly, but was grief adjacent, the particular loss of a life that had been built precisely and was now simply gone. She had nowhere to go back to. She had 3 days. And the man sitting across from her, whose name she had never known, whose child she was carrying, who had just watched the home she'd lived in for 6 years go up in flames because of what she represented to his enemies. That man was the only thing standing between her and what came next. She looked at him. He looked at her. The silence between them was no longer the silence of 2 strangers. It was the silence of 2 people who had just arrived, without wanting to, at the only arrangement available to them, and were both too clear-eyed to pretend it was anything other than what it was. I'm not leaving, she said. It wasn't capitulation. It wasn't trust. It was the arithmetic of survival, and she knew the difference, and she needed him to know that she knew. I know, Cassian said. I'm also not going to pretend this is anything other than a situation I'm managing. I wouldn't expect you to. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she looked away, at the window, at the dark outside it, at the city somewhere beyond it where her building was burning and the life she'd planned was ash. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She was in the home of a man who controlled a criminal empire. She had no apartment, no plan, and 3 days before the people who had just destroyed her home arrived at the gates of this one. And somewhere in the tangle of all of it, the thing she kept coming back to, the thing she could not set aside no matter how much the rational, clinical part of her wanted to, was that the man who had just turned her life into wreckage had also, without hesitation, called her before the window closed, sent a car, made sure she had a doctor, and told her the truth when lying would have been easier. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She pressed her hand to her stomach just once, just briefly. Then she looked back at Cassian and said, "Tell me the layout of this property. Every exit, every security position, every weak point. If I'm going to be here, I need to understand where I am." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and unfolded the map on the table and began to show her. The map was hand-drawn, updated in pencil, with corrections layered over older corrections in a way that told her it had been revised multiple times over multiple months. Cassian walked her through it without rushing. He named each exit, each guard position, each structural feature that served a defensive function. He described the perimeter wall's sensor array, the gate mechanism, the blind spots in the exterior camera coverage, and why they existed and what compensated for them. He spoke the way he did everything, with the economic precision of a man who had no interest in impressing her and significant interest in making sure she understood. She asked questions, good ones, specific ones, the kind that told him she was processing rather than simply receiving. He answered them straight. It took 40 minutes. When they were done, she knew the property the way she knew a building she'd worked in for a year. Not perfectly, but well enough to move through it without hesitation, and that was what she needed. She slept in a room on the second floor with a locked door and a window that she assessed as non-viable for external entry given the drop in the sensor coverage and the guard rotation that passed it every 22 minutes. She did not sleep well. She slept enough. Morning arrived gray and cold, the October light coming through the curtains without warmth, and she was awake before it fully arrived, sitting at the edge of the bed with her hands on her knees, running through the information she had and the information she still needed. The first full day at the estate established a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. Cassian's people moved through the property with a disciplined quiet. Shifts changed, positions rotated, meals appeared in the kitchen at predictable intervals without apparent coordination. She learned names. Yuri she already knew. There was a woman named Petra, mid-40s, compact and watchful, who appeared to be responsible for internal security coordination, and who looked at Eliana with the specific assessment of someone calculating variables. There was a young man named Dove who handled communications and spent most of his time in a room she hadn't been shown yet, though she'd identified its location from the cable routing she'd noticed during her property walkthrough. There were others, faces without names yet, but she was working on it. She was not a person who sat still in uncertain situations. She managed uncertainty by acquiring information, and she spent the first morning acquiring everything available. What she found over the course of those hours was that Cassian Dragovic's operation was not what she'd expected an organized crime enterprise to look like from the inside. It was quieter, more administrative. The people around her were not theatrical in the way she'd been conditioned by a lifetime of media consumption to expect. No visible weapons, no performance of menace. They were workers, competent, contained, and working very hard under what was clearly significant operational pressure. The pressure was visible in the communications traffic. She couldn't see the content, but she could see the volume. Dove's door was closed, but she could hear the cadence of calls through it, rapid and continuous. She could see it in the way Petra's expression tightened at intervals that corresponded, she suspected, to incoming reports. She could see it in the way Cassian moved through the second morning, working from his desk for 3 hours without stopping, and the particular set of his shoulders that was not tension, but was the physical manifestation of a man holding an enormous number of things simultaneously and refusing to drop any of them. She told herself she was observing all of this clinically. She mostly believed herself. On the second afternoon, she found him in the estate's east corridor, reviewing printed documents with Petra. She waited until Petra moved away before approaching. "The deadline is tomorrow," she said. "Yes." "What's your plan?" He looked at her. "I'm working on it." "That's not a plan. That's a status report." His jaw moved slightly. "I have 3 responses under development. The first involves financial documentation being transmitted to federal contacts that would neutralize the Vasiliev network's leverage over the port infrastructure without direct confrontation. The second involves a coordinated approach to two of the four families that might fracture the coalition. He paused. The third is defensive preparation for the possibility that neither of the first two succeeds before Friday. What does defensive preparation look like? Moving you. She went still. Where? A secondary location. More isolated, better fortified, fewer connection points to my known operation. He held her gaze. I don't want to move you. The transit creates exposure. But if the other options fail... I'm not cargo, she said. I know that. Then stop describing me like something you need to relocate. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he had. Not apology, not defensiveness, just attention, full and undeflected. You're right, he said, and meant it, which was somehow more disorienting than if he'd argued. She walked away before she had to figure out what to do with that. That evening, Fen came by for a second check. Her blood pressure had come down. The baby was fine. She'd confirmed by monitoring herself through the afternoon. She had enough clinical knowledge to track what mattered without equipment. Fen noted her numbers without comment, gave her additional progesterone from his bag, and told her the same thing he'd told her the night before. Rest, eat, manage the stress load. You're doing well medically, he said. Everything else is a different conversation, she said. He almost smiled. Yes, it is. After Fen left, she sat in the kitchen. She'd taken to using the kitchen table as a workspace, spreading the limited materials she had available into a kind of working order. And she was thinking about the federal contact strategy Cassian had described, running it through her own understanding of how institutional systems worked, which was not inconsiderable, when Petra appeared in the doorway. There's something you should see, Petra said. Her voice was level, but her eyes weren't. They went to the communications room. Dove was there, standing away from the monitors, which was the first anomaly. He was never away from his equipment when active. He looked at Cassian, who was already there, standing with his arms at his sides and the map of his face gone completely flat. On the central monitor was a feed. Surveillance, exterior, high angle. She recognized the property's perimeter wall in the frame, and then the section of east fence nearest the secondary vehicle gate, and then the figure near it. She looked at the figure for a moment before she understood what she was seeing. It was a man, youngish, dark jacket. He was standing at the interior side of the east fence, near the sensor array junction that she had specifically noted during Cassian's tour, because Cassian had pointed out that it was the most technically complex section of the perimeter. The man was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the sensor array. And he had a phone in his hand, and the angle of it suggested he was not calling anyone. He was photographing the array. She looked at Cassian. His face was doing nothing. That nothing was the loudest thing in the room. Who is that? She said. Cassian said a name. One word. She didn't know the name, but she knew instantly from the way he said it, from the quality of the stillness that came over the room, from the way Dove looked at the floor, from the way Petra's hand moved to the radio at her hip without touching it yet, that this was someone who should not be standing at the east fence photographing the sensor array. Get him, Cassian said. It took 4 minutes. She counted. They brought him into the room off the main hall, the same room where she'd first spoken to Cassian 2 nights ago, and he came in between 2 of the estate's men with his chin up and his eyes moving quickly around the room in the way that eyes moved when the brain behind them was still running calculations it should have run earlier. He was younger than she'd thought from the monitor. Mid-20s, maybe, with the kind of face that was still carrying the last traces of someone who hadn't fully arrived at what he'd become. His name, she learned over the next 10 minutes, was Tomas. He had worked for Cassian for 3 years. He handled vehicle maintenance and occasionally perimeter equipment. He had access, she understood immediately, to exactly the kind of technical knowledge that would make the sensor array photographs useful to someone planning an entry. Cassian stood across the room from him and said nothing for a long time. The silence was its own form of pressure, and everyone in the room felt it. How long? Cassian said finally. Tomas looked at the floor. Look at me. He looked up. His face was working through something. Not remorse exactly, more like the collapse of a story he'd been telling himself about what he was doing, the story giving way under the weight of the actual moment. 6 weeks, Tomas said. 6 weeks. Eliana did the calculation without thinking about it. 6 weeks ago was when Cassian's physician had flagged the insemination record. 6 weeks ago was when the Vasiliev network had learned about the pregnancy. 6 weeks ago was when this had all begun. They found your sister, Cassian said. Not a question. Tomas's jaw tightened. They said they'd... I know what they said. Cassian's voice was quiet in the particular way that quiet became its own threat. What did you give them? The access pattern for the South Gate rotation, the blind spot coordinates on the west side, the maintenance schedule for the sensor junction on the east side. He stopped. His hands were trembling just slightly at his sides. The physician's visit log. The physician's visit log. She felt that land with a cold, specific weight. They had known Fen was here. They had known she was here. They had known how to reach the east fence junction because Tomas had given them the maintenance schedule that described exactly when it was most vulnerable. My sister, Tomas said. They have her. If you... Where, Cassian said. I don't know. You negotiated with them for 6 weeks and you don't know where they're holding her. They never told me. That was the control. They said when it was done, they'd release her. If I stopped... His voice broke for a fraction of a second, and then he locked it back down with the particular effort of someone who had decided that breaking was not going to help him. I didn't have a choice. You had choices, Cassian said. You made all of them. The room was completely silent. Eliana looked at Tomas, at his shaking hands, at the collapse happening behind his eyes, and she understood with the uncomfortable clarity that clinical medicine sometimes brought that this was not a villain and not a hero. This was a person who had been placed in an impossible position and had survived it the only way he could see, and that the survival had required destroying the safety of everyone around him, and that both of those things were simultaneously true, and the truth of both of them together was the ugliest possible kind of truth. She looked at Cassian. His face was a wall. What do we do about tonight? She said. He looked at her. The question pulled him out of whatever was happening behind the wall and back into the present operational moment, which she suspected was intentional on her part, though she didn't fully examine why. They have the sensor schedule, he said. They know the East Junction vulnerability. They know Fen's access pattern, which means they know the physician visits correspond to a high-value protected individual. He stopped. They'll move tonight, before the Friday deadline, because the deadline was theater. The real timeline was always contingent on their intelligence being complete enough to act, which it now is. Yes, she let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Then we can't stay here. Agreed. The secondary location you mentioned. I have to get you there before they move. We have a window. Tomas's last transmission was 2 days ago, which means they're working from information that's 48 hours old. Some of it is still accurate, but the guard rotation has shifted since then. That buys us time. Maybe 3 hours, maybe less. Then stop standing here, she said. Something passed across his face. Not surprise exactly. He was not a man who surprised easily, but something adjacent to it, some barely perceptible acknowledgement of the fact that she was not asking him to protect her. She was telling him to move. And there was a difference, and he recognized the difference. He moved. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. Controlled meaning Cassian managed it. Chaos meaning it was a full estate on a 3-hour window, stripping down to mobile deployment. She watched Petra coordinate the personnel movement with the efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this contingency and was now executing the plan without allowing its unpleasantness to slow her down. She watched Dove transfer communications equipment with the practiced speed of a man who had broken a field station before. She watched the people around her, and she took her progesterone and she packed the nothing she had into a bag someone gave her, and she was ready before most of them were. Cassian appeared at her door at the 40-minute mark. Vehicle is staged. We move in 5. Tomas, she said. His expression didn't shift. He's handled. That's not an answer. He's secured. He's not harmed. His sister will be located and recovered through a separate channel. That's the only answer I have right now, and it's the honest one. She looked at him. He was carrying his jacket over one arm and a phone in his other hand, and there was a tension in him now that was different from the controlled professional pressure of the past 2 days. It was personal, tightly wrapped, the specific anger of a man who had been betrayed by someone he'd trusted and was refusing to let that anger change his decision-making. She recognized that. She understood that kind of discipline. She didn't admire it in him, exactly. She wasn't doing that, but she understood it. I need to know something, she said. He waited. The child, the heir. You said every organization in the country would come after you if you acknowledged the pregnancy publicly. She held his gaze. You haven't, publicly. No. But they know anyway. Through Tomas. Through the record. Not through a public declaration. So the escalation we're dealing with, this is still the preliminary. This is them moving before you make it official. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes. What happens if you make it official? More of them come, he said. Every family with a grudge, every contractor looking for a reputation-making job, every opportunist who thinks taking down the Dragovich heir is a career move. A pause. And certain protections activate that aren't currently in force. What protections? Agreements that go back decades. Structures that prevent all-out war because all-out war destroys infrastructure that everyone needs. If the child is publicly acknowledged, and I invoke those structures, the coalition attacking us becomes illegal under our own codes. The families have more to lose from violating those agreements than they gain from taking my child. She absorbed that. A legal framework. Criminal law, not civil, not criminal in the institutional sense, but law. Structure. The particular human instinct to create rules even in the absence of any authority to enforce them, because the alternative was chaos that consumed everyone. Why haven't you invoked it already? She said. Because invoking it requires the acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement makes you a target on every level simultaneously, not just operationally. He said it with the flatness of a man delivering the worst option in a list of bad options. I was trying to find another way first. And now we're on a 3-hour window with a compromised property and an operational team that's been reduced because I had to stand down half my people pending the breach investigation from Tomas's access. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated honesty that she had come to recognize as the most consistently reliable thing about him. There may not be another way. She thought about that. She thought about it in the 5 minutes before they moved, while she was standing in the hallway with her coat on and her bag in her hand. And she thought about it in the vehicle while the estate disappeared behind them in the dark. And she thought about it when the call came in at the 40-minute mark on the road. Dove's voice from the front seat, sharp and controlled, reporting that movement had been detected at the East Fence Junction. They'd moved earlier than 3 hours. The window had been shorter than Cassian estimated. The information Tomas had given them was either more current than Cassian knew, or they'd had a second source they hadn't identified yet. Cassian was on the phone immediately, voice low and fast, issuing instructions to the people remaining at the estate. She sat beside him in the back seat and listened to the half of the conversation she could hear and filled in the rest from context, and what she assembled from it was not reassuring. The estate was under assault. The 31 people Cassian had described 2 nights ago were now fewer. How many fewer she didn't know. And they were engaging an entry team at the east perimeter while simultaneously managing a secondary probe at the south gate that suggested a coordinated 2-point approach. The Vasiliev network had not waited for Friday. They had waited for the intelligence to be complete, and then they had moved with everything available. Cassian ended the call. He was looking at his phone. His face was the wall again. She said nothing. She waited. They're inside the outer perimeter, he said. Your people. Holding, for now. She looked out the window. They were on a state highway heading northwest, the city's glow fully behind them now, open farmland dark on both sides, the kind of emptiness that felt under these circumstances like exposure rather than safety. She looked at the back of Yuri's head, at the mirrors, at the pale reach of the headlights on the road ahead. Cassian, she said. He looked at her. She'd used his name, his real name, for the first time, and they both registered it without commenting on it. Make the acknowledgement, she said. He went very still. Invoke the protections. Whatever it triggers, we deal with it. But the alternative is spending the next 6 months of this pregnancy in a moving vehicle while your estate burns and your people die for a strategy that's already failing. She kept her voice level with the particular discipline of someone who was not calm, but had decided that calm was the only viable posture available. You said acknowledging the child makes me a target on every level simultaneously. I am already a target on every level simultaneously. The building I lived in is ash. I am 6 weeks pregnant in a car on a highway while your fortified estate is being breached. The worst case you were protecting me from is already here. He looked at her for a long time. It can't be undone, he said. I know. Once I make that declaration, Lucien, he stopped. The name arrived in the car with a weight that neither of them had been prepared for, a name for a child who was still 6 weeks of cells and a heartbeat she'd verified on her own monitor, and the weight of it was enormous. Once I declare the heir, this child's life has a specific shape. There are obligations, expectations, people who will spend the next 20 years trying to quiet. I understand, she said. Do it anyway. He looked at her with an expression she didn't know how to classify and didn't try to. Then he raised his phone and made a call. The conversation was in a language she didn't speak, Russian or something close enough to it. It was short. When he ended it, she felt the shift in the vehicle's atmosphere the way you felt the moment a match touched fuel. Not the burn yet, but the instant before it. The moment when the thing that was going to happen became unavoidable. It's done, he said. She nodded. She looked out the window at the dark farmland and the road ahead. She put her hand on her stomach, the gesture she kept making and kept catching herself making, and this time she didn't take it away. Behind them, somewhere in the city, the networks were moving. Call trees activating, old agreements surfacing. The machinery of a decades-old criminal code lurching into motion around a child who did not yet know it existed. And ahead of them, the road continued into the dark, toward a location she didn't know yet. And whatever came next would be different from anything that had come before because the choice had just been made that could not be unmade. She was not afraid. She was something closer to the feeling she'd had in the parking garage the night she'd run for the stairwell, the cold, precise, functional alertness of a person who has identified the threat and is still standing, and intends to keep standing, and is prepared to do whatever that requires. The vehicle moved through the dark, and somewhere behind the wall of Cassian Dragovic's controlled expression, in the space between the man who had built an empire and the man who had just staked it on a declaration he could never take back, something had shifted that was not strategy and not calculation, and not the professional discipline she'd been watching him maintain for 3 days. She didn't examine it, not yet. There was too much road still ahead of them, and the night was far from over. The secondary location was a farmhouse 40 miles northwest of the city, set back from a gravel road behind a tree line that provided coverage from 3 directions. It didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a working property. Barn, equipment shed, a vegetable garden gone to late-season frost along the south wall. The kind of place that didn't attract attention because it didn't look like anything worth attacking. She understood immediately that this was deliberate. Inside, the infrastructure was different from the estate. Leaner, stripped to function. 4 rooms on the ground floor, 2 above. Communications equipment in the back room that Dove had clearly pre-staged on a previous visit. Generator backup, water storage, enough food in the basement for 3 weeks. 6 people besides herself and Cassian, a tight perimeter rotation. Positions chosen for maximum sight lines down the approach road and across the open field to the east. She did a full walkthrough in the first 20 minutes. Nobody stopped her. Cassian watched from the kitchen doorway as she moved through the space, assessed, cataloged. He didn't comment on it. How many people know about this location? She asked when she came back through. 4 before tonight, he said. Now 8. Tomas. Didn't know it. I kept this property off the estate's internal records entirely. He poured water into a glass and set it on the table near her without ceremony. This one's clean. She sat down. She drank the water because her body needed it, and she was not going to let the accumulated weight of the last several hours make her careless about the physical basics. She was pregnant. Her body was doing something enormous and demanding regardless of what the world around her was doing, and she was going to respect that even when everything else was in collapse. The next 4 hours were the kind of waiting that felt like its own form of violence. Dov monitored the communications from the back room. Reports came in at intervals. The estate had held through the initial breach attempt. Cassian's people had pushed the entry team back to the perimeter, but 2 men were injured and 1 section of the outer wall had sustained structural damage. The Vasiliev network had retreated but not dispersed. They were regrouping at a staging point 3 miles from the estate, which meant they were preparing a second approach rather than withdrawing. The declaration had gone out. She didn't know exactly what form it took. Some transmission through the criminal network's internal channels, some formalized communication to the families that were party to the old agreements Cassian had described. She didn't ask for specifics. She watched Cassian's face in the hours after the call for evidence of the thing he'd described. The protections activating, the old agreements surfacing. And what she saw instead was the face of a man waiting to find out if the architecture he'd described to her was real, or whether it had eroded over the years without anyone noticing until the moment it was tested. At 3 a.m, Dove came out of the back room. "Two families have signaled compliance," he said. "Marchetti and the Okafor network. They've pulled their contractors from the coalition." 2 of 4. Cassian absorbed this without expression. "Vasiliev. Still active, and the Renner group is unclear. They haven't signaled either way." "Renner will wait to see which way it falls," Cassian said. "They always do." He looked at the wall for a moment. "It's enough. With Marchetti and Okafor out, the Vasiliev operation loses its flanking support. They're exposed." "They know that," Dove said, "which means they move now, before the coalition fully fractures, before they lose the window." The room went quiet with the specific quality of quiet that meant everyone in it had reached the same conclusion simultaneously. "They're coming here," Eliana said. Not a question. Cassian looked at her. Tomas didn't know this location, but the vehicle movement from the estate was tracked. They've had mobile surveillance on a 4-point coverage grid around the city for the past 48 hours. They may have picked up the routing. May have. "Probably did," he said, and the honesty of it landed without cushioning, the way his honesty always did. "We have, say, maybe 2 hours? Maybe less." She stood up. "Then tell me what you need me to do." He looked at her with the expression she'd seen once before, that barely perceptible acknowledgement that she was not a person to be managed or positioned, she was a person to be worked with. And he said, "The basement has a reinforced room, concrete walls, single entry. It was built as a storm shelter, and it will hold against anything short of military ordnance. I need you in that room." "I won't be in a sealed room while—" "I know," he said. "I know you won't. But you're 8 weeks pregnant, and you're the only person on this property who cannot be replaced, and I need to know where you are." His voice was quiet and absolute. "Please." The please was not nothing. She heard it for what it was, not manipulation, not performance. The word of a man who did not use it often and was using it now because he had run through the other available options, and this was what remained. She went to the basement room. She didn't like it, but she went. It was 9 by 12 feet, concrete on all 4 walls, and the ceiling, a cot, a battery lamp, a radio that Dove had pre-tuned to the internal frequency the team was using. She sat on the cot, and she listened to the radio, and she waited. And waiting was the hardest thing she had done in a year that had contained a significant number of hard things. The assault came at 4:47 in the morning. She heard it first as a change in the radio traffic. Voices tightening, the clipped professional exchange of people who had moved from readiness into engagement. Then she heard the physical noise above her, muffled by the concrete but present, 2 distinct impacts that she identified as breaching charges on the north side of the property. Then the irregular percussion of a firefight in the field to the east. She sat on the cot with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she breathed with deliberate control, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm she taught patients who were waiting for results that would change their lives. She applied it to herself now. She was a clinician. She was systematic. She could manage this. The radio told her what it could. Perimeter breach, north side. 2 of Cassian's people holding the barn approach. A third, name she hadn't learned yet, down with a leg wound. The farmhouse itself not yet breached. Then the radio went to static. She stared at it. She tried the frequency adjustment, cycling through the preset channels. Nothing. Either the communications equipment upstairs had been hit, or someone had put a jammer on the property, and both options were bad for different reasons. She sat in the silence, and she did the one thing she had trained herself never to do in clinical settings. She let herself feel it. The fear. The specific physical weight of it, sitting in her chest like a stone pressing against her ribs. She felt it for about 4 seconds, acknowledged it, and then she set it aside in the specific place where she kept things that were true and not currently useful, and she stood up. She was not going to sit in a basement room and wait while the radio was dead. The door was not locked. Cassian had asked her to stay, not confined her. There was a difference, and they both understood it, and she understood also that the difference meant she could choose otherwise. She opened the door and went up the stairs, and what she found at the top stopped her for a moment. The farmhouse's ground floor was smoke-heavy, not from fire, from a smoke deployment. Tactical. Someone had put canisters through the north windows. Visibility was down to 15 feet. She could hear close-range noise, movement, voices she didn't recognize, and then she heard a voice she did. Petra, short and hard, issuing a positioning command to someone at the far end of the front room. She moved through the smoke toward Petra's voice. Petra saw her, and her expression did the thing expressions do when they cycle through multiple reactions in under a second. Shock, anger, resignation, focus. "You need to go back. Radio's dead," Eliana said. "What's the status?" Petra looked at her for half a second. "North Breach is contained. East Field is contested. There's a team that came through the tree line on the south side. We didn't see it. They had a secondary approach we didn't have in the surveillance data." Her jaw was tight. "3 of ours are engaged at the barn. Cassian is—" A sound from the east side of the house. Not a shot. Something heavier. Wood. Stress fracture. The east door. They both heard it. Petra moved toward it, and Eliana moved with her because standing still in smoke in an unknown tactical situation was its own form of danger, and moving toward information was always better than having no information, which was the clinical logic she'd used to walk into the consultation room 3 weeks ago. And it had started all of this, and she was apparently not capable of making a different choice. The east door was off its upper hinge. The man who had come through it was on the floor. Petra had crossed the distance in the time it took Eliana to register the situation, and the result was that the man was down and Petra was already moving back. The smoke was thinner here, the east windows intact. "Where is Cassian?" Eliana said. "Barn, last position." She went to the east window and looked through it toward the barn. Through the smoke and the pre-dawn dark, she could make out movement. Figures, multiple, the specific chaotic geometry of a close-range fight, and in the middle of it, a shape that moved with the controlled economy she had cataloged and memorized from 3 days of watching. Him. She watched him for about 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds she understood the things she had been not understanding since the night he'd called her. The specific capability underneath the stillness, the reason the people around him moved the way they did, the reason the criminal organizations of 4 states had been trying for over a year to remove him from the board. He was not simply a powerful man in the abstract sense of financial and organizational power. He was physically, materially, functionally dangerous in the specific, immediate way, and watching it was not the thing she had expected to feel, which was fear, but something colder and stranger and more honest than that. Then one of the figures in the barn approached, detached from the fight, and moved not toward Cassian, but laterally, angling toward the farmhouse, and she tracked it, and it took her 2 seconds too long to understand what the lateral movement meant. Not toward the fight, away from it, toward the east door, toward her. She pulled back from the window. Petra was already gone. She'd moved toward the front of the house in response to something Eliana had missed. She was alone in the east room with the broken door and a man coming across the yard who knew exactly where the high-value target was being held, because the radio jammer meant the internal communications were dead and nobody had seen the lateral movement. She looked around the room with the specific speed she used when assessing a procedure room that wasn't set up correctly, and she had 45 seconds before the patient came in. Counter. Chairs. A tool cabinet against the wall. Agricultural, the kind that held wrenches and handled equipment. Door to the kitchen, left. Stairs to the upper floor, right. She went to the tool cabinet, opened it, and took out a wrench with a handle long enough to function as a lever and a grip. She held it the way she held heavy equipment in the lab. Not raised, not performative, at her side, ready. The broken door moved. The man who came through it was not large, mid-height, quick, with the practiced movement of someone whose effectiveness relied on speed rather than size. He had a phone in one hand, which told her he was reporting, and something else in his other hand that she didn't look at directly because looking at it would move her attention from his center of mass, which was where she needed to keep it. He saw her and he stopped. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She stood with the wrench at her side and she looked at him with the expression she had spent years developing for the delivery of catastrophic diagnoses. Not hard, not soft, simply present and clear, because she had understood in the 2 seconds since he walked through the door that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was demonstrate fear. He said something. Not English. Russian, maybe? The same language Cassian had used on the phone. "I don't speak that," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her midsection. The pregnancy wasn't visible. She was 8 weeks. But something in his expression shifted into a calculation that told her the information had reached him through other channels, and he was now cross-referencing it with what he was seeing. He put the phone in his pocket. He moved toward her. She didn't wait for him to close the distance. She moved first, not toward him, laterally, toward the kitchen door. And as she moved, she swung the wrench backhanded at the cabinet she was passing. Hard, not at him, just contact and noise, because noise and unexpected movement disrupted the expected script, and disruption bought fractions of seconds, and fractions of seconds were what she had to work with. He adjusted. He was fast. He caught her left arm at the kitchen doorway and her momentum went wrong, and she came down hard against the doorframe with her right shoulder, and the pain was immediate and bright, and she filed it away in the same place she'd put the fear, because it was true and not currently useful. She had the wrench in her right hand. She used it. Not elegantly, not like anything she'd been trained for, which was nothing like this. She used it the way a person used the one tool they had when the alternative was worse than the pain in their shoulder, with the full weight of her body behind it and no hesitation, aimed at the largest available target, which was his forearm. And the contact was solid enough that his grip on her left arm broke, and the sound he made was not pleasant, and she did not spend any time on how she felt about that. She ran. Through the kitchen, through the back of the farmhouse, out the rear door into the cold dark. And she ran the way she ran in the mornings along the lake path, except nothing about this was morning or the lake path. Frost-hard ground, low light, the barn ahead of her and the sounds of the fight still coming from the north side of it. "Cassian," she said it at a volume she calculated. Not a scream, not a whisper, the pitch and volume that carried without broadcasting. She went around the south side of the barn, and she said it again. He came around the corner of the barn at a pace that told her he'd heard the first call, not the second, and when he saw her, his face did something she hadn't seen it do in 3 days. It broke open for a fraction of a second, the wall coming down, and what was underneath it was not the controlled professional danger she'd been watching, but something rawer and less managed and considerably more human. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and his hands were on her arms, checking her. Not gentle exactly, urgent. And she said, "I'm fine, shoulder. It's fine. There's a man in the East Room. He had a phone. He was reporting my position." And Cassian said something that was not in English over her head, directed at someone behind her, and his hands didn't leave her arms. "The shoulder," he said. "It's not broken. I know what broken feels like." She looked up at him. His face had one cut along the left cheekbone, fresh, and his shirt had a tear along the right side, and his hands on her arms were steady, but she could feel the residual adrenaline in them, the fine wire tension of a body that had been in a fight and was still in one. "The man in the East Room." "Dealt with," said Petra's voice behind her. Eliana breathed out through her nose. Once, then again. Cassian looked at her face. "You hit him." "With a wrench." A pause. "Good," he said. It was such a stripped-down, straightforward response that something in her chest that had been clenched for approximately 72 hours released, just slightly, just enough to notice. The fight was winding down. She could hear it in the changed quality of the noise around the property, the shift from active to clearing. 3 of Cassian's people came around the north side of the barn, and their body language said what their faces said. It was over. This wave of it was over. Dove appeared at the farmhouse rear door, radio in hand. "Jammers down, we have comms back. Vasiliev's people," Cassian said. 4 down, 2 in custody, the rest have withdrawn. Dove looked at his phone. "And the Renner group just signaled. They're complying with the declaration. They're out of the coalition." 3 of 4. The Vasiliev network was now alone. Cassian absorbed this with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Fuller, somehow, carrying the weight of something that had been compressed for a long time beginning to decompress. "How many of ours?" he said. "Goran's leg." Benedict took a hit to the vest, bruised ribs, nothing broken. Everyone else is, get Fen out here for Goran. He looked at Petra. Full perimeter sweep before anyone stands down. I want the south approach covered. The secondary team that came through the tree line, they weren't in our surveillance data, which means there's an intelligence gap I need to understand before we assume this is contained. Petra moved. Dove moved. The property reorganized itself around the immediate imperatives. Cassian looked at Eliana. She was standing in the frost-cold dark with her coat, which she'd had the presence of mind to grab on the way out, and her damaged shoulder in the wrench, which she was still holding, she realized. And she looked at it, and then set it down against the barn wall, because there was no longer a reason to hold it. The basement room, he said. The radio went dead. I know. I wasn't going to sit there with no information. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, come inside. Inside the farmhouse, someone had opened the windows to clear the smoke. The east door was propped closed. The man who had come through it was gone. She didn't ask where and wasn't going to right now. The kitchen was intact and the battery lamp on the table was still burning, and the farmhouse had the specific quality of a place that had just been through something and was now reassembling itself around the after. She sat at the table. Cassian sat across from her. He poured water for both of them from a pitcher that had been there since they arrived, and he drank half of his and set it down and looked at the table for a moment. The declaration has changed the tactical picture, he said. Vasiliev has lost their coalition. They can't move openly now without violating the agreements that every other family has just signaled compliance with. Open violation means they become the target. Every organization that signed those agreements turns against them. He looked up. They have one play left. She waited. A direct strike, single operation, maximum force, aimed at eliminating me and taking the child simultaneously before the agreement structures fully activate and isolate them. He said it with the specific flatness of a man describing a diagnosis he wishes were otherwise. We have hours, maybe less, and we can't stay here. This location is burned. Where? There's a third location, a facility I've never used operationally. Nobody in my organization knows it except me and one other person who has been vetted past any level I applied to Tomas. He stopped. If I move you there, I'm splitting my team. I can't run the Vasiliev counterstrike and provide full security for your location simultaneously with the people I have available after tonight. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that the choice he was facing was between protecting her and finishing this. Then don't split, she said. He looked at her. Take me with you, she said. Whatever you're going to do to end this, I'm not waiting in another room while you do it. His jaw tightened. You're 8 weeks pregnant. I know exactly what I am. I'm also the reason this is happening, which means I'm going to be present when it stops. She held his gaze. I'm not negotiating this. The silence between them was dense and brief. Outside, she could hear Petra's voice coordinating the perimeter sweep, and Dov's voice on the radio, and the sounds of a team reassembling after a fight, professional and exhausted and still functional. She could hear the farmhouse settling back into its own structure in the cold. And she could see, in Cassian's face, the moment the last calculation finished and he arrived at the only remaining answer. He picked up his phone. He made a call. He spoke for 45 seconds and ended it. There's an abandoned steel processing facility 40 minutes south of here, he said. Vasiliev's operation has been using it as a forward staging point for the past 3 weeks. Our intelligence placed them there before the declaration. They'll fall back there now. He set the phone on the table. If we move in the next 30 minutes, we hit them before they can fully consolidate and before they can mount the direct strike. She looked at him. You're going in? Yes. How many people? Enough. A pause. Or not enough. We'll know when we're there. The honesty of it was, as always, brutal and clarifying, and she found that she had stopped being surprised by it and had started to rely on it, which was its own kind of information about where she had arrived over the course of 3 days. She stood up. She adjusted her coat. Her shoulder ached with a steady, informative throb that told her it would be functional for the next several hours and would present the bill afterward. 30 minutes, she said. Then we go. Cassian looked at her across the kitchen table in the battery lamp light, with the smoke still faint in the air and the frost outside and the sounds of his people moving through the dark around them. And he said the only thing left to say. Stay close. They left in 3 vehicles, 31 minutes after Cassian made the call. Eliana rode in the middle vehicle, with Cassian and Petra and a man named Cord, who had not spoken a single word in her presence in 3 days, and who held his equipment with the particular ease of someone who had carried it for a very long time. Yuri drove. The other vehicles flanked at intervals that Petra managed through the radio with brief numeric codes that Eliana didn't have the cipher for and didn't ask for. She sat and watched the dark fields moving past and felt the ache in her shoulder and the steady, non-negotiable presence of her own body, doing its work regardless of everything else it was being asked to endure. 40 minutes. She counted them. The steel facility appeared first as a structure against the pre-dawn sky. A long industrial silhouette, dead smokestacks, the specific geometry of a building that had been built for enormous functional purpose and was now serving a different one. No exterior lighting except what was coming from inside, thin lines of it visible through covered windows on the lower level. 2 vehicles parked at the east approach, a third near what had been the main loading dock. Cassian studied it through the windshield without speaking. 2 entry teams, Petra said. North service entrance and the loading dock simultaneously. You take the dock. I take the dock, Cassian confirmed. I want 2 people on Dr. Mercer at all times from outside the perimeter. I don't need... Eliana started. Yes, Cassian said without looking at her. Not a discussion. She let it stand. Not because she was conceding control, but because she understood the operational logic and arguing with operational logic in the last 30 minutes before a strike was not a productive use of anyone's time. They staged at the tree line 300 meters from the facility, and the teams moved with the particular compressed silence of people who had done this enough times that the fear had been metabolized into something usable. She watched them go. Cord went with the North team. Petra went with Cassian toward the loading dock. 2 men whose names she knew, Sev and a younger man called Rafe, stayed with her at the tree line. She watched. The assault went in at 5:43 in the morning, and it was nothing like what movies had prepared her to expect, which she had suspected would be the case. It was fast and close and loud in ways that didn't resolve into a narrative until later. Flashes of light through the covered windows, the sound of the loading dock doors going, voices she couldn't parse at this distance. 1 shot and then several in quick succession, and then a period of noise she couldn't classify, and then a long, complicated silence. Sev had his radio to his ear. His face gave nothing. She watched the loading dock entrance. A figure came out. Then another. Then Petra. Radio in hand, moving at a pace that said the situation was controlled but not finished. Then nobody for 2 minutes that felt much longer than 2 minutes. Then Cassian. He was moving at a different pace from the way he'd gone in. Still upright, still functional, but with the specific quality of movement that belonged to a person who had sustained something and was managing it. She saw it in the set of his right shoulder, which was wrong, too high, compensating. She saw it in the 3 steps before he adjusted and corrected it, and she saw the correction for exactly what it was. A man who was very good at not showing damage, making the calculation that he was being watched and acting accordingly. She moved before Sev could position himself between her and the dock. She crossed the 300 meters at a pace that was not running but was also not walking, and she reached Cassian as he was coming off the loading platform, and she put her hand on his right arm below the shoulder and felt through his jacket what she'd seen from a distance. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "It's a graze," he said. "Let me see it." "Eliana, I'm a physician," she said, and her voice came out with the specific authority she used in clinical settings when a patient was being difficult about their own care, and something in it seemed to reach through whatever he was doing with his face because he stopped arguing. She got his jacket off him in the pre-dawn cold with the facility behind them, and the team moving around them in the clearing phase, and she looked at what a graze from a firearm actually looked like on a human body, which she had seen in the emergency literature and the wound ballistics research, and which was different in person in ways that she had anticipated, but which still required her to take 1 breath before she assessed it with clinical rather than personal eyes. It was, as grazed wounds went, towards the better end of the spectrum. Lateral, upper arm, the tissue torn but the depth limited. It had bled significantly. His sleeve was soaked, which was why he'd been holding it high, but the vessel involvement appeared peripheral. She needed proper equipment to be certain. She did not have proper equipment. She did what she could with what Petra handed her from the field kit, which was adequate and inadequate simultaneously, and she worked with focused hands and said nothing about the fact that her hands were entirely steady, which she was privately grateful for. "The Vasiliev principle," she said while she worked. "Maxim Vasiliev, is he inside? Alive?" "Yes." She glanced up at his face. He was watching her hands on his arm with an expression she couldn't read clearly in the half-dark and the growing gray of approaching dawn. "You chose that deliberately?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Because killing him wasn't the right move." He paused, and the pause carried the weight of a man who had reached a conclusion that was different from the conclusion he would have reached before this week, before this specific series of events had changed the angle from which he was approaching certain questions. It would have felt like the right move. It would have been the wrong one. She tied off the field bandage. She pressed her palm briefly against the completed work, checking the pressure. Then she took her hands away and picked up his jacket from the ground. "Fen needs to see this tonight," she said. "I know. Properly, not a field assessment." "I know, Eliana." She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold was substantial now, the kind of early morning cold that had intention behind it, and behind him the facility was still lit from inside, and Petra's voice was audible on the radio coordinating the clearing, and the two vehicles at the east approach had been moved, and the whole scene had the specific quality of an aftermath. Not peace, not safety, but the strange arrested stillness that comes after sustained violence when the violence has, for the moment, stopped. Inside the facility, Maxim Vasiliev was in a room off the main floor under guard, and Cassian went in to speak with him alone, and Eliana waited outside because she understood this was not a thing she was part of and did not need to be. She heard very little of it. Voices, controlled on both sides. The conversation lasted 19 minutes. When Cassian came out, his face was the wall again, but it was a different wall. Not the suppression of anger or pain or professional calculation, but the particular blankness of someone who has just done something they had been building toward for a long time and is now standing on the other side of it and finding the other side quieter than expected. "What did you do?" she said. "The financial records that were supposed to go to the federal contact 3 days ago," he said. "Vasiliev signs authorization for transmission. Everything his network has built in the northern corridor goes into federal hands. The port infrastructure, the distribution layer, the legitimate businesses that serve as cover." He stopped. "He's done. Not dead. Done. Which is worse for him. And for you." He looked at her. "I lose the dispute. The corridor, the infrastructure, all of it." "That was yours." "It was." He said it without apparent regret, which was not the same as saying it didn't cost him. 3 years of work? "Yes." She looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light outside a derelict steel facility with his arm in a field bandage and his face doing the quiet thing it did, and she said, "Was it worth it?" He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved to her midsection, not pointedly, just briefly, the look of a man checking on something that had become important to him through a process that neither of them had anticipated or designed. "Ask me in 20 years," he said. She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost. She hadn't expected that to be available to her right now, and its availability told her something about where she was internally that she filed away to examine later, in a quieter place. They drove back as the sun came up behind the cloud cover, diffuse and colorless, the kind of dawn that didn't announce itself but simply arrived. Ben was waiting at a secondary location, a proper medical facility, private, with the equipment needed to do this correctly. He cleaned and closed the wound with the professional disapproval of a man who had been doing emergency aftercare for Cassian Dragovich for long enough to have opinions about the frequency of the requirement. Eliana stood and watched Fen work. Then Fen turned to her and checked her shoulder. Bruising, no structural damage, which she had assessed correctly in the field, and checked her blood pressure and her pulse, and said the same things he'd been saying, which were still true. The baby was fine. She sat in the chair in Fen's examination room after he left, and she pressed her fingertips to her eyes, and she stayed there for a while. Cassian came in and sat in the chair across from her. He did it the way he'd been doing things since she'd met him. Without ceremony, without announcement, just present. He put a cup of tea on the small table beside her, which she hadn't asked for, and she picked it up because it was warm, and she needed warmth more than she needed to maintain any particular position about unsolicited gestures. "Your building," he said. "The contents, whatever was lost." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't manage me with money right now. It's the wrong thing." "All right," he said. She drank the tea. He sat. Outside Fenn's window, the colorless morning was developing into something that might eventually become a day. "I need to understand what comes next," she said. "The Vasiliev transmission goes to the federal contact this morning. The legal process that follows is complicated, but the outcome is predictable. The coalition is fractured beyond repair. 3 of 4 families have complied with the declaration, and the 4th is neutralized." He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. "The threat to you, to the child, is not eliminated in perpetuity, but it is eliminated at the operational level for the foreseeable future. The declaration protections hold. The criminal operation," she said. He looked up. "The network, what you built. What comes next for it?" A pause. "I've been thinking about that for 3 days." He said it with the honesty of a man who had actually been thinking about it and had arrived somewhere, not with the performance of a man offering what he thought she wanted to hear. The legitimate businesses, the hospitals, the foundation infrastructure, the shelter network, those continue. They don't require the criminal layer to function. They require money, and I have money that is clean enough to support them for the rest of my life. And the other layer? It's already damaged. The corridor dispute cost me 3 years of work. The Vasiliev transmission costs me more. What remains is smaller than it was, and continuing it requires rebuilding in a context where the declaration makes me and everything adjacent to me a protected target for anyone who wants to challenge the agreements. He stopped. The math doesn't work anymore. Not for what I'd be trading. She looked at him. He was 37 years old. He had built one of the largest criminal operations in North America and was describing the deliberate dismantling of it with the same flat precision he applied to everything. And underneath the flatness was something she'd been watching grow since the night she'd climbed into Yuri's car outside her building. A tiredness, not the acute exhaustion of the last 72 hours, but a deeper kind. The kind that came from carrying something for years past the point where it made sense to carry it. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at her as if the question was one he hadn't been asked recently. "For the child to grow up in a world where the name Dragovich doesn't carry a target," he said. "For whatever comes next to be, something other than what came before," he paused. "For you to stop looking at me like you're waiting for the version of me that you'll need to protect yourself from." She held his gaze. She held it for a long time, and she let herself do what she'd been refusing to do for 3 days. Look directly at what she saw, without the clinical buffer, without the self-protective habit of translating everything into information to be assessed rather than something to be felt. She saw a man who had told her the truth when lying was available, who had made a phone call she hadn't asked for and sent a car she hadn't known she needed, and stayed in rooms with her when he could have left, and had made a declaration that cost him everything he'd built because she'd asked him to, who had gone into a building before dawn with a wound she hadn't known about yet, and had come out carrying only what he'd gone in to do. She saw the damage in him too. She was not eliding that. The violence, the years of it, the things that had been built and the things that had been destroyed in the building. She saw the specific texture of a person who had lived inside a system that extracted its costs invisibly until the account was much larger than expected. She saw all of it. "I don't know what this is," she said. "What we are." "No," he said. "Neither do I. I'm not going to perform certainty about it." "I wouldn't believe you if you did." She set down the empty teacup. She looked at the window, at the morning outside it, at the particular light of a day that was arriving whether or not anyone was ready for it. "I need a place to stay," she said. "That isn't your estate and isn't a farmhouse and isn't a location selected for defensive utility. I have an apartment in the West Loop. Clean title, no operational connection. Fenn can base the prenatal care from his private clinic 3 blocks from it." He paused. "It's yours. Whatever arrangement you want." "I'll tell you what arrangement I want when I know what I want," she said. "That might take some time." "Take the time," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to push?" "No." "Why not?" He looked back at her with the gray-green eyes that were the first thing she'd noticed about him in a consultation room that felt like a different era now, though it was barely a month ago. "Because you're the most deliberate person I've ever met," he said, "and because you've been pushed by everything else for the last several weeks, and I'm not adding to that." A pause. "And because whatever you decide, the child is mine, and I'm not going anywhere, so I can wait." The room was quiet. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She stood. He stood. She looked at him for one more moment with the full directness she'd been withholding for days, and then she said, "The wrench." He blinked, which was the closest she'd seen him come to being caught off guard. "What?" "In the East Room. The wrench. You said good." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The same almost smile she'd seen almost materialize before, and which now, in the gray morning light of a medical room in a private clinic, arrived fully for the first time. It changed his face completely. It was... She did not let herself finish the observation, but she noted it, filed it in a specific place, and acknowledged that the place was not the clinical file. "Good," he said again. She looked away before she did something with her own face she wasn't prepared to account for. She walked out of the room. He fell into step beside her, not close, not performatively distant, simply present in the way he was present at everything. And they moved down the hallway toward the clinic's exit and the morning beyond it. The city was already awake. It always was, Chicago, indifferent to the specific shape of anyone's night, moving through its own enormous life, with the total impersonalism of a city that had seen everything and classified it all as weather. Traffic on the street. A food cart open on the corner, steam rising from it into the cold air. A woman walking a dog with the expression of someone whose morning had not yet fully arrived. All of it normal. All of it going on exactly as it had the day before and the day before that, and every day she'd walk through it on her way to work, carrying her plans and her discipline and her careful managed future. She stopped on the front step and breathed the cold air. Cassian stopped beside her. She put her hand on her stomach. She'd been doing it for weeks, and she was done catching herself doing it. It was what her hand wanted to do, and it was honest. And honesty, she had learned recently, was something she was willing to spend more on than she'd budgeted for. 8 weeks. A heartbeat she'd verified with her own equipment and her own clinical hands. A child who would have, when it arrived, the name of a man who had just walked away from an empire because the empire's price had finally exceeded what it was worth. She thought about the morning she'd sat in her office and scrolled to profile 1117 and clicked without ceremony, believing she was making the most rational, unromantic, efficient decision available to her, believing that love was a variable she'd removed from the equation and that the equation was better for it. She thought about the ways the world had a specific talent for finding the places where you'd lock the door and deciding that was exactly where it was going to come in. "Fen at 9, she said. "I'll be there," Cassian said. "I'm not asking you to be there. I'm stating that Fen is at 9. "I know," he said. "I'll be there." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the street with his hands in the pockets of his coat, the field bandage hidden under the sleeve, his face doing the quiet thing. And he looked... She searched for the word and found it with the same precision she applied to clinical language. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere, not comfortably, not easily, but genuinely, and was standing in it. She looked back at the street. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing about rebuilding a life that had been pulled from the wall like wiring was easy, and she didn't tell herself otherwise. There were legal processes. The federal transmission from Vasilyev's authorization created a cascade that touched several legitimate institutions, including the clinic, which required depositions and documentation and 3 separate meetings with attorneys, 2 of whom she did not tell everything, and 1 of whom she told enough. She moved into the West Loop apartment, and she made it hers, which took longer than she would have preferred and cost her more emotional effort than a practical relocation should have. She worked. She went back to the clinic 6 weeks after the night she'd fled through the service exit, and walking in through the side entrance at 6:42 in the morning with her badge clipped to her coat and her coffee already cold in her hand was one of the stranger experiences of her life, the absolute continuity of routine against the absolute discontinuity of everything that had changed. Danny Foss met her at the elevator and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You look different." "I'm pregnant," Eliana said. "I know, that's not what I mean." Eliana walked to her office. She did not examine what Danny meant. She had a full morning. Cassian came to Fenn's clinic at 9 and at every subsequent appointment, and he sat in the appointments with the specific contained focus of a man who was learning something and taking it seriously. He did not perform enthusiasm. He asked questions that were direct and specific and which told her he'd been reading, which she'd expected. He was thorough about everything he touched. This was apparently no different. The last of the criminal infrastructure was dismantled over 4 months. Not with drama, but with the particular grinding administrative effort of unwinding something complex. Lawyers, former associates, asset transfers, negotiations with the federal contacts that Cassian handled with the same pragmatic directness he applied to everything. There were things she didn't know the details of and didn't ask about because they were before her and therefore not her accounting to manage. There were things she knew clearly and watched him handle and filed under evidence, not of who he had been, but of who he was being. He did not move into her apartment. She did not suggest it, and he did not push it. He had his own space. He came to the appointments. He came when she called, which was not often, because she was not a person who called often, and he seemed to understand this without requiring explanation. He was learning the specific grammar of her, and she was learning his, and it was slow, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Lucienne arrived on a morning in late March, which was 7 months after a paperwork error had put a man with a false name in a consultation room on the second floor of a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation before 7 in the morning. He arrived with the standard difficulty and extraordinary violence of a person making their first entry into the world, and Eliana worked through it with the same discipline she brought to everything. And when it was finished and he was placed in her arms, she looked at him for a long time without saying anything. He had gray-green eyes. She had not expected that to make her breath catch. She was a physician. She understood genetics. She had known, abstractly, that this was a statistical possibility. But the abstraction was not the same as the small, definite, absolutely specific face looking up at her with the unfocused intensity of a person who had just arrived somewhere and was already taking inventory. And she felt the breath catch and let it, because she was done managing what her body did with information that deserved to be felt. Cassian was in the room. He had been in the room for the duration, which had not been her original plan and had become, by the 3rd hour, a plan she was too occupied to revise. He stood near the window now, far enough to give her space, present in the way he was present at everything. And when she looked up at him, she saw his face doing the thing it had done in the early morning outside the loading dock. The wall down, the thing underneath it completely unmanaged and visible and human. She held out the child. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took Lucienne with a carefulness she had not seen him apply to anything else, which told her something true about the hierarchy of what he was capable of being careful with. He held the child against his chest and looked at him and said nothing. She watched him. She watched the most feared man in the organized crime architecture of North America hold a 7-pound person with gray-green eyes and not move, not speak, not do anything except be changed by it, visibly, in real time, in a way that no amount of discipline or professional training was sufficient to manage. Lucienne, he said, quietly, just the name. She felt something in her own chest settle. Not fall, not collapse. Settle. The way a structure settled when the load was finally distributed correctly, and the thing that had been under unsustainable pressure found its equilibrium. Lucienne Dragovich, she said. He looked at her over the child's head. She held his gaze. She thought about Profile 1117 and the click of a mouse on an ordinary morning and the life she'd been planning, neat and manageable and free of the complications that looked like need. She thought about a parking garage and a stairwell and a gray car at the corner of Illinois and Wabash. She thought about a wrench against a door frame in the dark. She thought about the ways some things could not be planned, could not be optimized or controlled or approached with clinical distance. The way some things simply arrived, and the only honest response was to be present for them. He has your eyes, she said. Cassian looked back at the child. His jaw moved just once, the way it did when he was holding something. Then he said very quietly, he has your hands. She looked down, the small, tight fists against his chest. She had not noticed that. She looked for a long time. Outside the clinic window, the March morning was arriving with its particular tentative quality, the light still figuring out what it was going to commit to, the city moving in its indifferent enormity below. The same city that had been burning her building and staging assaults through tree lines and running surveillance on her parking structure was also, simultaneously, opening food carts and walking dogs and going about its enormous ordinary life. And both of those things were true at once. And that was what this world was. Not one thing, not the other, but the constant, uncomfortable, essential coexistence of both. She reached out and put her hand over Lucian's back, her hand over Cassian's hand, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be more true than the gesture itself. The cheapest choice on a clinic database. The paperwork error. The man with a false name who read every line of a consent form and asked whether patient data had been exposed and walked out of a consultation room carrying a secret she hadn't known enough to look for. None of it had been a plan. None of it had been what she'd been trying to build. It was in the end exactly what she had needed. Not the thing she'd selected, not the thing she'd controlled for, not the clean, manageable, emotionally uncomplicated path she'd designed with the precision of someone who had decided that wanting things too much was a clinical liability. It was the thing that had walked in through the door she'd locked. And she found, holding her son in a room filling slowly with March light, that she was not grateful, exactly, not the easy word, not the resolved narrative that wrapped everything in meaning it hadn't earned. She was simply present, awake to it, willing to carry it with both hands, the weight and the warmth of it together, the way anything real had to be carried. That was enough. She was beginning to understand, more than she had ever let herself have before. And outside, the city continued, and the morning settled in, and the name Dragovich moved quietly into a different kind of future than the one it had been built to inherit. Not an empire, not a throne, not the architecture of fear and controlled violence that generations had constructed and defended and bled for. Just a child with gray-green eyes and a mother's hands. Just that, just enough.